podcasts.
The Profile. You're listening to Premier Christian Radio.
Where faith comes to life.
Well, good afternoon and welcome along to the programme. I'm Justin Brierley, your host for The Profile today, brought to you as usual in association with Premier Christianity magazine. If you'd like a free sample copy of the latest edition of the mag, do go online to premierchristianity.com/free sample. We'd be delighted to send you one. This programme is the place where we meet all kinds of interesting, different Christians from all different walks of life. And today on the show, I'm meeting John Dickson. He's a Bible scholar, he's an ordained Anglican minister, and author of more than a dozen books, including his most recently published A Doubter's Guide to Jesus. He's also the founding director of the Centre for Public Christianity in Australia. CPX, as it's known, was launched to engage the public with a clear, measured and respectful picture of the Christian faith and the way it can impact all of life for the good. And John's also going to tell us about the most recent major project from CPX, a documentary called For the Love of God, how the church is better and worse than you ever imagined. John, thank you so much for being with me on the programme.
Great to be with you, Justin.
It's lovely to have you. Let's talk first of all about you growing up, before we get to any of the interesting stuff I've just mentioned. It'd be great to hear about your own background. Were you born into a Christian family?
No, classic Aussie household, which is no religion. And I grew up in a very stable home at one level. I did lose my father in a plane crash when I was 9, and so obviously that upset things quite dramatically. But we'd never been inside a church. As I understand it, when my parents met, Mum did go to church on a Sunday. Dad went to the races on a Sunday, and Sunday was their only day to catch up. So they sacrificed the races and church, and then raised their kids without any connection. I'd never been inside a church till I was maybe 16.
Gosh.
But I had a hunch about spiritual things. I can remember as a 10-year-old saying the Lord's Prayer in the old-fashioned form. Had no idea what God was doing art in heaven for. The whole thing made no sense to me. But I said it nonetheless.
Yes.
And when I eventually did become a Christian, I thought it was near miraculous that I had already intuited that prayer that the Christians pray.
Yeah.
You know, it's like a miracle.
Yeah.
Until many years later, I was preaching in a church as an assistant minister and told the story of how I'd miraculously known the Lord's Prayer before I'd ever been in a church. And this woman came up to me saying, "Don't be ridiculous, John. I was your babysitter when you were 9 and I taught you the Lord's Prayer."
Brilliant.
So
slightly punctured your illusions of some miraculous downloading of the Lord's Prayer. But
Indeed. But it was a teacher at school who in year 9, so about 15, 16 years of age, was clever, funny, generous and Christian.
Right.
And it was really through asking her questions that I figured that Christianity had more to it than I had realised, and found myself drawn to the person of Christ. She did what would now be illegal, and that is invite the class to her home on Friday afternoons after school for hamburgers, milkshakes and scones. My mates and I turned up, ate her food, and thought we'll put up with her religion bit and then get out of here. And we ate her food and it was delightful. And then she brought out the Bible and we thought, oh no, maybe she's a witch or something. But she had a marvelous strategy. She just fielded our questions. And I did have a few questions. And we came back the next Friday and the next and the next. And she decided to read us the 4 Gospels because she knew we knew nothing. So she thought, well, if I'm going to get one bite with these lads, the person of Jesus. And she was right. It was really the person of Jesus that captivated me. And I pivoted somehow around 16 years of age from a fan of Jesus to a follower.
And what did that look like for you in terms of where it took you next? Did it mean you kind of had to, even as a 16-year-old, start to reassess the things you were doing, the way you were living your life?
There was a bit of that. I had been in trouble a little bit with the police. Nothing dramatic, but dramatic enough to worry my mother. And I'd gone to child psychologists who thought it was my dad's plane crash that had really caused me to act out.
Right.
I just think I was a jerk, and I just wanted everything to go my way, and so I hardly worked at school. I got into quite a few fights. I was a bit of a bully in those days, and I think that might have been the most instant change. The realization that this one that I'd come to be enamored with in the Gospels was not a bully. Immense power combined with humility. And so that messed with my head. And I think the idea that I loved him and he loved me made me think, I should probably not pick fights.
Yeah. And the rest, as they say, is history in terms of you're still obviously going strong years and years later. When did sort of a call to ministry in the church begin? And tell us about the bit along the way where you were also in a rock band.
Well, in some ways, the rock band was part of what I thought I should do to promote Christ. So from a very young age of Christian faith, 16, 17, I thought, how can we get this out? This is amazing news. It's terrible that so few people know about it. And my mates and I thought we should start a band. We thought we had invented Christian music, I'm ashamed to say. We had been blissfully kept from Christian music in those days, and thought, we would do this amazing thing of play in pubs and clubs and talk about our faith between songs, and the world would become Christian.
Which is not a bad ambition to have, let's say, though obviously you weren't the first to invent that concept.
We soon found that out. And but the band was pretty successful. We played all through our final years of school in pubs and clubs, but eventually it took off as a full-time thing, and I got to tour the world with my best mates, who had also become Christians with me through this teacher, around the world for 6 years.
And what kind of crowds were you playing to? Was it mainly Christians, or was it a mixed?
Mixed. Sometimes originally it was all just pubs and clubs.
Yeah.
And eventually churches would hear about us and hear that we not only played music that was acceptable, we would talk about our faith between songs. So churches would get together in towns all around Australia and invite us to come and play in their local pubs, town hall, schools, prisons, and not so much churches. And we would just play that town, maybe 5 to 6 shows a week in the town, and share our faith. And so churches were our benefactors, as it were, but not our audiences.
So it was, in that sense, quite an evangelistic kind of...
It was, yeah. We were really trying to promote Christ.
Yeah. And what kind of success did you see with that? I mean, I think these days, even many Christians are a bit wary of being too overt with your faith if you're in a rock band or something.
Yeah.
Because I think lots of bands who are Christians that start up kind of are wary of being pigeonholed, into the
Well, we had
Christian
no
subgenre.
expectations because we thought we'd invented it.
Exactly.
So we
you had no
blissfully
idea
went
about
out
these
there.
issues, yeah.
And we did have occasions where people threw their beer cans at us in the pub. As soon as I
Started preaching.
I'd say I'd go, this next song is about the love of the Creator, and many people would just. But before I'd got into my little spiel about how people might dispute that, I had a beer can thrown directly in my head. This is the Manning Bar of Sydney University, which is ironic because I now teach at Sydney University. But often people just put up with it. Yeah. And sometimes we would speak for 10 minutes between songs. It looked like a long song introduction. What success did we have? I mean, one has to leave those sorts of things to the Lord. But I meet people regularly, even today, who became Christians through that. The mail we got as a band, and this is back when people did write letters.
No emails back then.
No email. Was so great that we had to take a day off a week. So we were full-time, but a day off a week just to reply to our mail.
Amazing.
And very little of it was, we love you. That all went to the guitarist, not to me. Most of it was, when you said this about God, what did you mean? Or, okay, I think I want to be a Christian, but no one in my family is. And we just had to write letters a day a week. And I think that was probably where I learnt to write. in fact, I think my first couple of books were probably just the best letters that I'd written hundreds of times to teenagers struggling to know what Christianity meant.
Wow. Do you play guitar yourself? Was that your instrument?
I was the lead singer
as well.
I was the lead singer and principal songwriter. So I played guitar well enough to write songs, and rarely on stage, maybe 2 songs a concert. I was not very good. I'm still not very good.
It's a bit like Bono in U2. He very occasionally gets the guitar out, but leaves the tricky stuff to Edge, basically.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love that comparison. Yes. Just like
Bono. It's official. I mean, that obviously was an important part of your life in the, I guess, 80s and early 90s.
Late 80s, early 90s, yeah.
Yeah. And what kind of took you on a journey then to eventually, obviously, go beyond that and go into kind of what you're doing today? In a sense, related, but quite different. Biblical scholarship, Anglican ministry, and, of course, latterly founding this Centre for Public Christianity.
It's all just, I want to make Christ public. To me, it is one thing that I've been doing since the band days. And even the writing of books, really, as I said, came out of the letters I'd have to write to people who wanted to know more about the Christian faith. So writing just seemed like a great way to promote Christ. I'd written my first 2 books, I think, before I'd gone to theological college. But the reason I went to college was it dawned on us all that we could very easily end up in 10 years down the track completely shallow, impressive at one level, loud PA, light show, songs, then move on to the next town, but completely shallow, because I was saying the same things between songs in that town and that town and that town. And it worried us, actually. So we disbanded with half a mind to get back together after a degree in theology. I now laugh at that expectation. But 3 of us from the band and 2 of our crew went to theological college. Yeah. And we were the only ones at college not to have degrees already. So we were nervous as anything. We were just musos who'd come out of high school and had been full-time. And ended up loving it and doing really well in it. And because I'd done well in it, I enrolled straight away after my degree in a postgraduate degree, and then pivoted to ancient history, which I pursued at an academic level. I also, somewhere in there, started to work for a local church because I was pretty convinced, despite how helpful running around the country singing and speaking was to people, probably the best argument for Christianity are those little Christian communities in the suburbs and cities that are really living out the Christian faith. So I wanted to get in on that. Yep. And since those days, right up till today, I've pretty much been a half-time minister in just 2 churches where I've done that ministry. So even today, I'm still a half-time minister of an Anglican church in the suburbs.
And that goes alongside the academic side of what you do.
And then the other half of my life is everything else.
Yeah, sure.
So it's very simple. It's just 2 things. It's just church and everything else. And the everything else, is a little bit of academics. So I did my ancient history at Macquarie University in Sydney, which is a very large ancient history department, and specialised in the origins of Christianity in the Roman world, which seemed to be helpful for me to make Christ public. Yeah. So even the academics was really just about that same thing. And now I teach a course on historical Jesus in the Jewish Studies Department, of all places, at Sydney University. Yeah. So not religion, not theology. It's just really a Jewish history course. Jesus was a Galilean Jew, and that's the extent of my academic involvement. I'd never want to be a full-time academic. I don't have the temperament, probably don't have the gifts, but I'm happy to have a hand in it.
Yes, and I guess it's very helpful for you in terms of navigating what I see you as doing in terms of the public sphere, the intellectual sphere, but also kind of having that sort of pastoral approach to it, because obviously you hear the kinds of issues and problems people are going through on a weekly basis through what you do in that way.
Yeah, I often feel that these things keep me grounded, liking people, which is always good to like people, and liking what's true. Yeah. And I think a lot of people who are a bit skeptical of the faith worry that Christianity doesn't have any intellectual credibility. And I think it's important to help them see that it doesn't always, but it can.
Maybe a bit later on in the second half of today's programme, I'd love to maybe open up whether that study itself led you to any questions or concerns of your own. But we'll leave that for the second half. I want to kind of ask you about the Public Centre for Christianity. That's relatively recent sort of thing that was established in Australia, I think out of the Bible Society in Australia. What's the purpose of this particular institution that you founded?
Yeah, so we started back in 2007, actually, and it was just a crazy idea that a couple of scholar friends and I had for a decade or more, but had no means to accomplish it. And the idea was simply, imagine if there were a group of scholars who could also communicate and engage the public media with a generous, thoughtful Christianity. Wouldn't that be great? And there came an opportunity in 2007 where I was actually about to move to England to take a semi-academic job. And a friend in Australia said, England doesn't need any more of what you got to offer. Stay here. What would it take to keep you here? And I opened my big mouth about this idea of scholar communicators. And he said, give me 48 hours. Within 24 hours, he'd found a very significant grant that made it possible, just like that, to start the Centre for Public Christianity. And that seed funding allowed us to employ people, get offices, get a TV and radio studio, and just start. We arrived at the office day one and thought, okay, let's try and write an opinion piece for the local Sydney Morning Herald, which is pretty sceptical but reputable major broadsheet newspaper. And so we sat down, we wrote a piece, sent it off. Within a day, they said, yeah, sure, this will go in tomorrow's paper. We're like, what? It worked? And so that's what we kept on doing, just writing opinion pieces. Yeah. And the opinion pieces led to media appearances, because if someone, if a media outlet sees something interesting argued in an op-ed, they invite you for a radio interview, and it really developed out of that. I continued to write books, I continued to do academic stuff, but engaging the media was an important part of it, as were making documentaries.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I led CPX, the Centre for Public Christianity, for 10 years, and they were just fantastic years.
And as you say, it began with writing op-eds and obviously branched out into other forms of media that you started pursuing. And overall, as I see it, this has been about trying to change the tenor of the conversation in the media, which is can be very largely dismissive or critical or anti-religion even. And so I guess it's not that you're specifically trying to evangelize, but you are kind of trying to, I suppose, feed a different perspective on faith.
We want to make Christ public, and we're happy to do that on any topic. And so just as happy to write a film review or engage with environmental theory, as much as write an Easter opinion piece arguing Jesus rose again in the mainstream press. So we're happy, have been happy to do everything. But yes, trying to convince the average Australian who may not know a Christian, at least they may not know, they may not have a friend who they really know is a Christian, convince them that the idea of Christians being mean and dumb isn't always the case. It can be the case, but we often feel it's a huge win for Christianity if people watching us in the media or reading an op-ed come away going, oh, that Christian wasn't as dumb and mean as I thought. We go, yes, that's fantastic. Because at least it gives them, good reasons to either investigate or not investigate Christianity instead of the silly reasons.
Yeah, I often feel the same way about my Unbelievable radio show and podcast, which is always presenting both sides of the case, but hopefully a skeptic who listens will at least come away with at least one preconception gone, which is that Christians are people who believe in fairy tales and are basically brain dead. So I can see the attraction of that. What about the general climate, though, in Australia? Do you find that there is a lot of skepticism out there in the kind of general population towards Christianity? What does it look like in terms of on the church front? I mean, a lot of us are familiar with your probably most famous church export, Hillsong, but what does it actually look like in Australia when it comes to the general acceptance of Christianity, I suppose?
It's mixed. And that word really does sum it up. So we have about 15% church attendance up to once a month in Australia, which is actually, that's a lot of people.
Yeah.
More people attend church each week than watch our biggest rating TV show on the weekend. So it's not a little thing.
No.
And weirdly, more people attend church than play all forms of competitive sport in Australia.
Per weekend, as it were.
Per weekend, yeah.
Oh, great. Right.
Which is kind of weird considering sport's meant to be our religion.
Yeah, exactly.
It's really mixed. And actually some studies have been done that have found top 10 perceptions of Christians by the average Australian population. And sort of 10 to 6 are judgmental, opinionated, hypocritical. And 5 to 1 are kind, truthful, caring. And you look at that data, that's quite fresh actually, just a couple of years ago, and you think, hang on, is there one half of Australia that thinks Christians are all jerks and another that thinks they're really nice? Or is it that the average Australian has two Christianities in their head? And I think this is the better thesis. A Christianity in their head that they have met, or at least seen on the telly, that is judgmental and hypocritical and bigoted, frankly. And yet there's Auntie Flo, who's obviously that really into Christianity and is the most beautiful person in my extended family, sort of. And so as Christians interact with the general Australia, it seems to me we can activate one or other of those perceptions of Christians very easily.
And rather like here in the UK or in the US, often perhaps the negative impressions come from when the general population see the church as being somehow anti-stuff or bigoted or whatever it might be, though those are often can just be perceptions from the media more than anything. I mean, there was one big issue that obviously last year was a big kind of defining issue for Australia, the gay marriage kind of referendum, in a sense, that wasn't legally binding, but I think was soon put into law, which saw gay marriage become legal. That happened here in the UK a few years ago as well. Yep. It's happened recently in America. You were among a number who were, I think, asking people to consider not taking that option of gay marriage becoming legal. What was the kind of the reasoning that you were trying to put forward to? How were you trying to influence from your perspective, without becoming across as the arrogant, narrow-minded, bigoted Christians or whatever? How were you trying to kind of feed into that whole debate that was going on?
I was trying to avoid being in one or other of those political camps. So there was a no campaign that I didn't have anything to do with. And we were asked to be involved. The Centre for Public Christianity was asked to be involved. And it was clear to us that wasn't the sort of thing that we're interested in, because legislating on that kind of issue, I think, has limited scope. And it seemed to us from way out that the result was going to be a pretty clear yes to same-sex marriage. So we didn't want to engage with the no campaign or the yes campaign, obviously. And CPX itself remained completely silent through that whole thing. I did a little bit of public engagement on it, as just John Dickson, who had some thoughts. Yeah. And my goal was not to persuade people to vote no, but to help the average Australian see that maintaining the classical view of marriage is not necessarily dumb or mean. That was the only thing I wanted to do. I didn't want to move people to vote a particular way, but help what I knew would be a majority of Australians who were voting yes to same-sex marriage at least consider that this old view is shared by humanity universally, frankly, for a reason. It isn't mere tradition. There was actually a logic to it. And yet Christians can hold that traditional view and still be completely fine with a country that votes yes to same-sex marriage, and be as cheerful the day before or the day after as the day before, and engage with same-sex couples just as cheerfully. That's the kind of vision I wanted to offer, and still want to offer. It's still a major blocker for people. But as soon as they can see you don't have to be an idiot or a jerk to hold traditional marriage as the kind of the ideal, as soon as they can see that, they're willing to listen to other stuff Christians might talk about.
Yeah. I mean, do you feel like as those kinds of social issues have come more and more onto the radar that might be in conflict with, traditional evangelical kind of views, that it's been harder at any level for churches to kind of put themselves across in Australia? Do you think that it has sort of cemented a kind of view in the public's mind that these are the regressives, we're the progressives? Yeah,
it has. And I significantly blame the No campaign for the way it conducted itself. It was a negative campaign. It was, if you vote this way, terrible things will happen.
Right.
And even if some of those terrible things about discrimination law and so on, and the status of religion, even if some of those things have come true, it was entirely negative scare campaign. Instead of saying, here's one or two reasons we think traditional marriage isn't as dumb and mean as you thought, that would have been great. Then traditional Christians would have lost well. And I often feel losing well is the mission of the moment. Not deliberately go out to lose. Try and persuade, but do it with such a cheerfulness and a spirit of generosity that when you lose really well, and people go, oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, they're good losers at least. I think that's a great place for Christians to occupy, because losing well is a Christian specialty from the beginning.
We'll talk more in a moment's time. This is The Profile. You're listening to me, Justin Brierley, in conversation with John Dickson today, Bible scholar, ordained Anglican minister, author of many books, including A Doubter's Guide to Jesus. We'll talk about that next. And the project that John's been involved in recently, a special documentary called For the Love of God. You're listening to The Profile here on Premier Christian Radio. Don't forget, you can find this online at premierchristianradio.com/The Profile, or wherever you get your podcasts from. And we'll be back in a couple of minutes' time.
After growing his Californian congregation from 30 members to 6,000, Francis Chan turned his back on the American megachurch model.
Look at churches. There are so many who exist that are not making disciples. People are not getting baptized, and yet they're spending a fortune. How is it then that the underground church in China grew to 100 million people?
Inspired by churches in Asia, the acclaimed preacher believes he's now promoting a more authentic expression of Christianity. Read the full interview with Francis Chan exclusively in this month's Premier Christianity magazine.
For your free copy, visit premierchristianity.com/free sample.
The Profile. You're listening to Premier Christian Radio.
Where faith comes to life.
Welcome back to the second half of today's edition of the programme. I'm Justin Brierley. In the interviewing chair this week for The Profile with John Dickson, Bible scholar, Anglican minister. He's an Aussie as well. Did you come over just for us, John? I doubt it. Probably doing a few other things.
This is a very special moment in my trip.
That's a great way of putting it. You are the founder of the Public Centre for Christianity in Australia, which you've been telling us about. I'm looking forward to hearing more about this film that you've been working on so hard over the last year or so. The Profile comes to you in partnership with Premier Christianity magazine. If you'd like a free sample copy of the latest edition of the magazine, go to premierchristianity.com/free sample. John, we've been talking about your growing up, the rock band, going into sort of more academic stuff, your ministry, and the way that all of this has been about making Christ more public, essentially. Someone told me, and you can confirm whether this is true or not, that you were partly the inspiration behind the Hillsong song "The Creed," which is the kind of the Christian doctrines, the beliefs, the Orthodox Christian beliefs, set to music, and it's been fantastically successful. Is that true?
I had nothing to do with the actual writing of it, so it comes with no royalty. But yes, I am the reason they wrote it, because I tweeted saying Hillsong would be doing world Christianity a favor if they put the most shared statement of Christian belief in one of their beautiful songs. Someone tweeted straight back from the Hillsong creative team and said, "We'll have a think about it." And then I got a phone call from them, and they said, "Yeah, we're going to give it a go.
Fantastic.
And would you be willing to, when we've got a demo, come and have a listen?" And so I did. They took me out to breakfast, and I met the songwriters and the creative team, and they played me a demo of the song and said, "What do you reckon?" And I thought, it's actually really good.
It is. It's a great song.
I wish I could lay some claim to the creativity behind it, but that is all them.
It's kind of nice, the rock musician has a second, aim at stardom through Hillsong.
Well, the rock musician now nerd.
I love it. But that song, has been played in countless churches. We play it in our church. And what I love about it, as I'm sure you do, is the fact it is words that go back to the very beginning of the Christian faith, but done in this tremendous contemporary way.
It's a great statement about Christians do have some things they share, because you hear from a lot of skeptical people, you guys can't even work out what you believe. Come back to me when you can agree on something. Well, here is 83 words in the original Greek. 83 words. Christians say, yep, we believe this. That's something.
Yeah, absolutely. And in a sense, kind of takes you back to the fact that from the beginning Christians have been singing their truth, if you like. And I think actually the way we imbibe a lot of scripture and doctrinal truth is through singing. And maybe that's kind of faded away a bit in more recent kind of the, charismatic songs that have been a bit more Jesus is my boyfriend, as they say, and haven't contained as much of that kind of core truth and stuff. And maybe we're kind of moving back to kind of embracing more of that again now?
I think we are, and I think it's a beautiful thing. I mean, the evidence we have from the New Testament period is that Christians sang psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. And we have a couple of examples of the songs in the New Testament embedded there. Very probably Colossians 1 and Philippians 2 contain early hymns, not in the classic style we'd recognise, but certainly in the chanting style. And one of the documents I played with up in Oxford in my research is the earliest fragment we have of a hymn, a Christian hymn, with musical notation. It's from about the year 200. But there were plenty of other hymns, but this is the first hymn that actually has the ancient musical notation on it. I intend to do something with it, by the way. And it's obviously in Greek, but it's incredibly theological and very Trinitarian. Right. Already by the year 200, it's very Trinitarian in its outlook. So singing's a crucial part of Christian engagement with the public and personal devotion.
And it strikes me, Hillsong is one of the most well-known contemporary Christian songwriters these days. Their songs are sung in churches all over the world and have been for a few decades now. It's interesting to see that they really have, in my view, developed a lot of good, strong theology and biblical content in a lot of their most recent stuff. Do you think that they're sort of seeing that now as
I know
kind of...
I know it for a fact. Yeah, I've become quite friendly with a lot of those people. And they are really into theology. They are reading John Stott. They're reading James Packer. They're reading Tom Wright. They're reading Tim Keller. It's like they're really excited about grounded theology connected with something really old. And it is showing. They've employed a guy called Robert Ferguson, who's like the theologian in charge of the songwriting. So all songs go through Ferguson for sort of review. And he's got a really good eye to theology. But the great thing is they don't seem to worry about taking risks with poetry. Sometimes people from my more conservative tradition are so concerned about the truth, we don't let poetry get in the way.
Right.
But actually, you just have to read the Psalms to realise, actually, you can press the borders of theology to evoke something that's real. With good poetry. And I think Hillsong are doing this pretty well.
Do you have an example in mind, particularly, of where they've kind of done that really successfully, kind of blending that that sort of doctrinal stuff with something quite poetic, something that kind of tries to express the truth of something.
Well, I think this Creed song
Yeah.
is the classic example
Yeah,
of them
yeah.
being really theological. There's another one. I don't actually listen to much Hillsong
Yeah.
music. There is one. I think it's called Grace Alone, or Grace is Enough. Anyway, I could
Yeah.
almost sing it for
Yeah,
you. But this seems really theologically thought through and sees everything through the lens of Christ's death and resurrection as the grace for seeing all of life.
Yeah. Well, obviously, it's great that you've had a little part to play in one of the songs there. In terms of your own journey, though, with Jesus and specifically the historical Jesus, when you began that journey of engaging with the academic study of the text, what we can know about Jesus and so on, that in many ways has been a big part of your story, and you've written books in this area and so on. Did it come with any doubts and uncertainties along the way? Because I think a lot of Christians, when they start to get into the specifics of the biblical manuscripts and what we can know and what we can't know, suddenly they're presented with the fact that we're doing history here, and sometimes history doesn't always paint a perfectly obvious picture of what was going on. And for some people who kind of like to deal in certainty, let's say, that can be something that's difficult to square with their faith.
Yes. Every Christian is stuck with history because our texts are historical. I mean, even the skeptic agrees they're making historical claims. It's about this guy who was crucified under the 5th governor of Judea, right? So that's not saying God has a wonderful plan for your life, which is unverifiable. Christians say this happened.
Yeah.
And so every Christian is stuck with this in a way that actually the other world faiths are not. They're sort of blissfully untouched by the historical scrutiny. So I think every Christian has to just get on with the sense that these are historical claims and they ought to be open to historical scrutiny. To my own sort of doubt and faith, I suspect that when I was first really getting into history, I revered history as a discipline, as a way of knowing. And because I revered it, perhaps a little too much, I almost came to the point where if there were some doubts about something in the Gospels, it would cause me a little doubt. Or if there are some things in the Gospels that history can't actually judge on because there are no external documents, I would be a little bit worried about that. I never had a crisis of faith, but I do remember thinking so highly of history that if history couldn't back up the Gospels, maybe a little bit wobbly. I've since come through to have a much more measured view of history. It's just one way of knowing. It's certain rules that, in some ways, lowest common denominator.
Yeah.
That a skeptical person like Bart Ehrman can agree with a not so skeptical person like Richard Bauckham on the method of history. And so that's great, but it can't be the only way of knowing stuff. Historical method may lead to some awkward conclusions about things in the Gospels or Paul's letters or whatever. But if you don't revere history as the only way you could know about such things, then it's not going to cause you problems. And I think I've got to that point where I now think history is really fun, but I'm not in awe of it.
Yeah.
I think it's a limited human discipline, like all sorts of things. And my confidence in the Gospels isn't based only on history. It is partly based on history. I'm more than ever convinced the core of the narrative is historically sound. But history doesn't give you all the bits and pieces of the Gospels, and who cares?
Of course, the historical aspects are kind of important in terms of a lot of people to have some basic questions, about Jesus. And I think the problem is that there does exist, unfortunately, in culture, this idea, probably populated a lot by internet sites, that Jesus never even existed. That's a common misconception that's out there. What would be sort of your kind of, 2-minute response to the person who says, but I read a website the other day and it turns out Jesus doesn't even exist?
Well, my 2-second one is read something other than a website. Because you find out very quickly that mainstream secular scholarship has zero doubts that the broad outline of Jesus' life, this Galilean teacher supposed miracle worker who was crucified under Pontius Pilate is beyond reasonable doubt. I mean, there are historical ways we can actually demonstrate that if we have more than 2 minutes, but I think there's a shortcut. Go to any one of the deliberate secular compendiums of ancient historical knowledge. They're very easy to find in great libraries. There's the Oxford Classical Dictionary, 1,600 pages summing up everything we know about ancient Greece and Rome. There's the Cambridge Ancient History Volume 4, which deals with the Augustan period. There's the Cambridge History of Judaism. There's Brill New Pauli, the big German 22-volume historical study. And go to the bits on Jesus and read them. And you'll find zero doubt is raised in what are secular compendiums of scholarship about the broad outline of Jesus' life. It is beyond doubt. So, I mean, although, people can read on the internet, Josephus was tampered with and Paul believed in a mythical Jesus, not a historical Jesus, all that is a little bit nutty, and there's a really easy way for people to see it. Go to the compendiums. There's no doubt.
You wrote a book recently, A Doubter's Guide to Jesus. What do you find are the main doubts that do surface about Jesus when you speak to people?
Well, when you jump over the did he exist business, people obviously think about the miracles. Sure, he might have said lovely things, and I quite like those lovely things he said. Can't quite remember on the spot anything that he did say, but I'm sure he said, be nice to people. So people are kind of accepting of that, but the idea that he gave sight to the blind and healed the lame and so on, that's really problematic. And the way I approach it in the book is not to say I can prove the miracles, but it's interesting that even the most secular scholars today agree Jesus did things everyone thought were miracles, because the evidence is too good to just dismiss it, to say, that's a late accumulation, that Jesus was not remembered in the first tradition as a healer. Well, he very clearly was. And so even someone like Paula Fredrickson, who has no Christian faith, will say that Jesus did things contemporaries believed were miracles. And so I think that gets a reader to the point where they go, we have the kind of evidence a miracle worker would leave behind. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't, but at least the data that we have is consistent with. And so they park that and keep reading and stuff about the judgment of God that Jesus preached. There's a whole chapter in my book about Jesus as judge, which causes doubts because it's not a very pleasant thought. And the way doubts so often work is really just psychological. I don't want there to be judgment. I don't want this idea, and so I doubt that Jesus really said that or whatever. And of course, the resurrection is the punchline of the whole thing. And again, history can't demonstrate that he rose again, with deference to some other scholars who think that it can. I think the rules of history are entirely secular and naturalistic, and they're rules I'm happy to play with. And what we can say about the resurrection is that there was very probably an empty tomb, and certainly many people claimed in good faith to have seen him after his death. They seem to be the things even highly skeptical people will say, that's very likely. The interesting thing is that's exactly the kind of evidence a resurrection would leave behind. It's therefore consistent with it being true. It's not so consistent with it being false. And all I want readers to do is get to the point where they go, okay, history at least is consistent with the Jesus narrative. I'm willing to really read the Jesus narrative for myself. And for me, that's how I view history. It takes away very bad arguments for not looking into this. It provides pretty strong arguments for why Christianity can be viewed with a level of confidence, or the Gospels can be read with a level of confidence. So not so that people will become Christians as a result of reading my book. I think that's very unlikely with a more historically oriented book. But they may pick up a Gospel and say, I'm going to read this for myself. I think that's where the scary business begins. Yeah. Because people arrive at their doubts and their belief based not just on intellectual considerations, but social, psychological, emotional, etc. And when they bring their whole self to a gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, I don't mind, just go for it. I think the whole of their person, intellectual, social, psychological, is confronted by an extraordinary person that captivated me. And I still trust that he's captivating people all around the world.
If you want to get hold of it, again, the book is called A Doubter's Guide to Jesus. And I'm sure both Christians and people who are on a search would benefit from reading it. I want to ask you, before we talk about the Love of God film, given that the average person maybe has all kinds of different perspectives and doubts and questions on Christianity, if you were just sat down with someone and you had 90 seconds, let's say, to explain in simple terms what the Christian gospel is, what the message is, what you're inviting people to, if they're going to become a Christian, how would you try to explain that?
Very difficult to do in 90 seconds, but I'd probably convince people to read one of the four Gospels. I would use my 90 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
Unless they were dying and said, what must I do to be saved? I would just say, cry out to the God of mercy and he will lovingly forgive you because Christ died and rose for you. All your punishment taken away. Right. So if they're like, what must I do to be saved? That's where I go. Mm-hmm. If I have 90 seconds and likely to catch up with them again, I give them a bunch of reasons why the Gospels can be read as real accounts of the life of Jesus, because I am absolutely convinced by something that ancient Christianity was unanimous about, but modern Christianity not so much. That is, the Gospel is what's in the Gospels.
Mm-hmm.
That's how come they're called Gospels, because ancient Christians knew that what's in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is the gospel that was preached. They didn't just invent this word gospel as a new literary genre. It was actually, this is the proclamation. This is what everyone proclaimed now in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And of course, Mark opens up his gospel by saying, this is the gospel, right? So you can't really argue with that. That is the gospel. So I would use my time to say these are real accounts of a real historical life that fit with the archaeology, that fit with the text that we have of the period, fit beautifully into the Jewish context that we know of Jesus. Are historical biographies, and you'll find that character really compelling. And in the end, I would ask people to look out for this punchline, that God is opening up his kingdom to people who don't deserve it through the life, teaching, healings, death, and resurrection of Jesus, the King of that kingdom.
It's a good answer. Let's talk about, with the remaining time we've got, the latest project from CPX and yourself, which is For the Love of God, How the Church is Better and Worse Than You Ever Imagined. It's premiered recently here in the UK. It's been in lots of cinemas in Australia. People can get hold of it via the website. I know that you're putting it out on as many different channels. You've had a version go out on ABC, which is kind of the Australian equivalent of the BBC. So it's a very exciting project. But what is For the Love of God, if you wouldn't mind telling us?
It's a brutally honest, we think, brutally honest account of the best and worst of Christian history. Centre for Public Christianity had devised a documentary on the world religions. We'd written it. We're going to do something on the 5 major world faiths. And then 3.5 years ago, maybe more now, we just felt like religions aren't going anywhere. We can come back to that. The real question at the moment is, has Christianity only damaged? Has it just raped and pillaged through history and it's bad for us today? So we set about doing that, and it took us 3 years to write and produce, where we offer real honesty about the Crusades, the Inquisitions, the witch trials, but also honesty about the beautiful things that Christianity has given the West, the motifs that secular humanists most love today are entirely Christian gifts.
What do you mean by that?
That annoys my secular atheist friends, but it's so palpably the case.
What kind of motifs are you talking about?
If you went back into Rome or Athens in the middle of the 1st century and said, is every human being inestimably and equally precious? You could not find someone who thought so. The Greek and Roman paradigm said that maybe the stuff of humans, the physical stuff of humans, is equally low, but the gifts that individual humans have, intellectual, physical, artistic, mean that people aren't equal. And so there was a strong empirical argument about grading human beings. But you might find a few Christians in the year 50 in Rome and in Athens, and Jews, of course, who said they're all made in the image of God. Absolutely, inestimably, equally precious. And it was the Christian proclamation of that Jewish motif of the image of God that gave the West its view that everyone is equal. And it's pretty hard to argue out of that based on just the empirical sources.
I had a very similar conversation in this studio with N.T. Wright and Tom Holland, who's a popular historian here in the UK.
Yeah, I know Tom Holland's work.
Yeah, and Tom very much said the same thing, that as a non-Christian, it was actually studying the Roman Empire as a historian that made him realise just how much we owe today to Christianity, which was so radically different in its day and age to what was around it.
The notion of compassion to the poor, that the absolutely poor actually deserve the wealth of the rich. That's how valuable. That was unknown in Greece and Rome. The doctrine of humility, that actually the goal of life is to use all of your powers in service of others. I mean, the very word tapeinos in Greek, humility, and humilitas in Latin, meant servitude, crushed, down low. Christians, in almost a macabre upending of values, said, no, they're really good words. I know they mean low, but it's really good. It's really good to be low. Even if you're high, if you lower yourself for the sake of another, that's awesome. And people just thought, what are you talking about? But that caught on. And even our average secular atheist today goes, yeah, if you're a great person, like with all sorts of gifts, if you pour yourself out for others, that's really beautiful.
But they don't realise just what a strange idea that would have been going back 2,000 years before the advent of Christianity.
You need a story that says absolute greatness went to the absolute shame of a Roman cross in order to upend all of that.
So that's how the church is better than you imagined in that sense. But then obviously those same secularists will frequently point out the Crusades, the way they would say the church kind of brought about the Dark Ages by kind of, standing on top of scientific inquiry and that kind of thing. All of that stuff. That's a familiar narrative. How does the film try to deal with those kinds of issues?
Again, honestly, the caricature of the story that you just told, almost no one in a medieval department or Middle Ages department in universities today agrees with.
Okay.
In fact, they even avoid using the term Dark Ages because it was far from dark in terms of its literature and philosophy and so on. But Christians did some terrible things. You can see a pivot in the 4th, 5th century when Christians are starting to talk about just war for the first time. And it's quite a breakthrough for Christians. They were mostly entirely pacifists up to that point. But Augustine and others had to do some fancy thinking about, there are so many of us now and the emperors want our opinion. Here's how you could have a just war. And so they allowed the possibility of warfare that Christ would approve of. It was still a warfare that only had to be in response to evil or to protect victims, had to be conducted in a way that didn't leave those who lost feeling resentful of the victor and so on. There are all sorts of things, but it opened a door. So that by the 8th and 9th century, as Christians moved throughout Europe, they adopted the kind of warrior culture all around them and justified it theologically. And you eventually get the Crusades at the end of the 11th century. And the dogma was, not only does God approve of this battle, but you can be saved by participating in this battle. That was the new thing.
It'll earn you kind of credit in heaven, basically.
It will.
Yeah.
And the way we treat this in the documentary is we interview the top scholars in the world, Thomas Madden in the US and Christopher Time at Oxford University, that everyone will say they're the top of the tree on the Crusades, and we just let them speak. So we were very deliberate about the kind of scholars we chose. We had 50 interview subjects, and they are recognisably the world leaders in all of these areas. And we can happily, or maybe not happily, but willingly offer the terrible things Christians did.
You kind of own up to the good and the bad.
Yeah, it was Jesus who said, take the log out of your own eye. Okay, so this part of the film is doing that. But part of what gives us the freedom to do that is anyone can tell that when a Christian is hateful and violent, they're not following their master. They're defying their master. And the basic argument of the film is Jesus wrote a beautiful tune, the love of enemies, self-giving, and so on, that Christians have sometimes performed beautifully with lasting results, and sometimes they've gone right out of key and participated in all that is base and common to humanity, warfare, torture, and so on. Christians didn't invent that. They didn't give that to the Western world. You just go back to Greece and Rome, they were doing fine on the torture and warfare front. The real gifts of Christianity are not their participation in violence. The real gift is the love of love that our culture now assumes. We love love. Love is awesome. Well, that came from somewhere.
Yeah. What kind of reactions are you getting to people who go and see the film?
Mostly from the mainstream media in Australia, surprise that Christians, a centre for public Christianity, has produced something that's pretty honest about the failings of Christianity. And I think this is in a
good
context,
quality as well. That's
and
not
it's,
mentioned.
you know,
Let's
the
not
production
forget
values
that.
are
Exactly.
production values are great. But I think there's a mood in Australia, particularly following a royal commission into child sexual abuse in the churches, that says Christians cover up their sins. You know, if a priest has been caught molesting someone, they move that priest, they cover it up. In that context, I think people have thought, oh, that's really weird that Christians just owning up to the terrible. So actually, we've been delighted at the response from mainstream media. I must say some Christians are disappointed with the production, that maybe we've let Team Jesus down a little bit by being too candid about the stories we tell. Because the film doesn't work as we start on all the bad stuff, so that by the last 45 minutes you've forgotten it because it's all great. We go back and forth, and basically say they've sung the tune beautifully and they've sung it terribly. They've sung the tune beautifully and they've sung it terribly.
But I'm so glad that you are telling that story honestly, because I think, especially with what I do with my Unbelievable show and podcast, is people want to hear both sides, and they kind of can tell if they're just getting the version, of just the one side, the polished and neatly presented version, and that's not the way life ever works, is it? So it's good to have both sides.
It is remarkable and surprising, and you know, I've watched your podcast many times, and it's a perfect example of this exact thing.
If people want to get hold of it, wherever they are in the world, even if it's not showing in a cinema near them, how can they do that?
Betterandworse.film. And you can watch the 4 episodes or the 90-minute version. You can purchase it. But the amazing thing is you can watch the entire thing in 5-minute grabs if you want, free of charge. So you can search Crusades or search Witch Trials and just go to the scenes on that free.
Right. Fantastic. Again, that's I've got another one here, for the love of God project.com, but you've got
betterandworse.film.
Betterandworse.film.
The easiest to remember.
That's an easy one. Thank you so much for joining me on the program today, John.
Thank you.
And if you want to find out more about the Centre for Public Christianity as well, that's publicchristianity.org, a fantastic organisation that John founded out in Australia. It's been so good having you on the profile today. Thank you very much. All the best as you go back to Oz at some point in the near future. And we look forward to seeing you again soon, hopefully, when you're next over.
Thanks, Justin.
You've been listening to The Profile with me, Justin Brierley. Don't forget, you can find today's show wherever you are in the world as a podcast or via our website, premierchristianradio.com/The Profile. And don't forget, while you're at it, to check out the latest edition of Premier Christianity magazine. We're brought to you in partnership with that monthly publication. If you'd like a free sample copy, you'll find it at premierchristianity.com/free sample. Coming up next, some of the best bits from the past week here on Premier.
Introducing Zaxby's new chicken finger tacos. One with pico and creamy chipotle ranch, and the other with bacon and avocado ranch. Chicken expert since 1990. Taco expert since now. Woo, saucy! Zaxby's.